The dust of the Ardennes still clung to the air, a choking, metallic red shroud that covered everything. The shattered forests, the turned-over tanks, and the frozen, broken bodies of men. For 2 weeks, the ground had been a screaming inferno, a place where idealism went to die, replaced by the grim, visceral need to survive. And in the heart of that controlled, calculated violence sat General Marcus Ironhide Thorne. He was a legend carved in granite, a man whose reputation preceded him like the roar of an advancing tank division. A staff officer once wrote that General Thorne's blood pressure was the most stable measurement in the entire European theater of operations, even while under heavy bombardment. He was ruthless, not out of malice, but out of a mathematical certainty that victory demanded the absolute expenditure of resources, human or otherwise. He had ordered battalions into certain doom, not in desperation, but as cold, tactical necessities. He had seen young men incinerated by artillery fire and had simply adjusted his collar and called for a more aggressive flanking maneuver. His eyes held the flat, impassive glaze of a man who had not cried since he was a child, and who had vowed never to again. He was the hammer of the Western Allies, and he was unbreakable. Now, in the makeshift command post, a shell-shocked farmhouse whose walls still smelled faintly of burnt hay and fear, Thorne sat staring at a stack of after-action reports. The battle was a costly success, a mathematical triumph of American logistics and firepower over German desperation. But down below the final casualty figures, there was a secondary report, recovered enemy effects. These reports were routine, tedious paperwork, cataloging captured material, documents, and personal items. They were meant for intelligence, for the cold eyes of analysts far behind the lines. Thorne never read them. He never needed to. An enemy was an enemy, a number to be reduced, a line to be pushed back. They were pieces on a board, not men with mothers and wives. Yet, this time, something was different. A young lieutenant, pale and shaking from the 2 days he'd spent tagging bodies in the deep snow, had bypassed the chain of command. He'd placed a single, small package on the general's desk, not among the reports, but right in front of him. It was wrapped in thin, mud-stained parchment, tied with a frayed piece of German uniform thread. The lieutenant had merely whispered one sentence before retreating. "Sir, this one was different. Just read it." Thorne, the man who had stared down the collapse of entire flanks without blinking, felt a flicker of annoyance, a strange, momentary pause in the relentless grinding of his war machine mind. He reached out and picked up the package. It felt insubstantial, fragile, almost alien compared to the heavy reports and the steel of his pistol. What could a scrap of enemy paper possibly contain that could warrant the attention of a 4-star general? What human moment, what piece of private, desperate grief could possibly penetrate the mathematical shield of a man whose only focus was the methodical destruction of the Third Reich? General Marcus Thorne was a rock, an immovable force. But the title of this forgotten report suggested an impossible truth: the U.S. general who cried after reading a fallen enemy's letter home. The question was not if the general cried, but what monstrously powerful human truth was contained in that single, muddy letter that could shatter the armor of Ironhide. The conflict that consumed General Thorne's every waking moment, World War II, was less a war of men and more a monumental clash of industrial capability. The Allied victory, the eventual crushing of the Wehrmacht, was always a mathematical inevitability. It was determined not on the muddy battlefields of the Ardennes, but in the sprawling, humming factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. While the German war machine, brilliant in its early, swift maneuvers, relied on a shrinking pool of skilled labor and finite resources, the American war effort operated on an exponential curve. This was the fundamental, inescapable truth that justified every one of Thorne's cold decisions. Thorne understood this better than anyone. He could recite the monthly production figures for the Sherman tank, the B-17 bomber, and the gallons of high-octane fuel needed to move his divisions. He knew, with mathematical precision, that for every bullet the desperate German soldier fired, the American logistical machine could manufacture and deliver 50. His certainty, his infamous ruthlessness, was rooted in this cold, hard arithmetic. When his commanders questioned his costly frontal assaults, he would simply point to the casualty ratios and the replenishment schedules. They lost one man, they got two more. The enemy lost one man. They often got only a shadow of a replacement, an elderly man, a teenage boy, a soldier recovered too quickly from a wound. It was a war of attrition, and Thorne was simply applying the most efficient solution to the equation. This was the cost of efficiency, the dehumanization of the enemy into a mere fraction. The theater of operations was crucial. Thorne was fighting on the Western Front, a front that, while horrific, benefited from a robust supply chain that stretched all the way back to the American heartland. His soldiers, though enduring unimaginable hardship, ate better, drove more reliable vehicles, and were backed by a relentless air force. He stood in stark contrast to the German high command, who were forced to make increasingly impossible choices, sacrificing one crucial sector just to shore up another. The political and military atmosphere of late 1944 was defined by this brutal, one-sided mathematical reality. Germany was collapsing. The question was simply how many lives it would cost the Allies to administer the coup de grace. For Thorne, the German soldier was a variable destined for zero, nothing more. Thorne's philosophy was forged in this crucible of industrial war. He had fought the initial engagements with a profound sense of vengeance, a response to the surprise and shock of Pearl Harbor and the reports of atrocities trickling in from the Eastern Front. His early career had been marked by a fierce patriotism and a deep-seated belief that the German soldier was merely the physical manifestation of an evil ideology. They were the enemy. They represented Hitler, the SS, and the concentration camps. To fight them was a holy mandate. To kill them was to perform the necessary surgery on the diseased body of Europe. This worldview was not just convenient. It was essential for a general who had to send thousands of men to their graves. He saw the Iron Cross, the Führer portrait, the field gray uniform, and he saw only the enemy, a concept, not a human being. This was the framework that protected General Thorne. This mathematical, ideological shield kept the screaming ghosts of the battlefield at bay. His expectations for any German soldier found dead were simple. They were fighters to the last, fanatics, men who deserved the fate that had found them. Any personal belongings were merely intelligence assets or discarded enemy property. There was no room for introspection, no space for the individual tragedy of the men he killed. If a single tear were to fall, it would suggest a hesitation, a crack in the mathematical certainty of his orders, and that was something he could never allow. The cost of emotion, Thorne believed, was defeat itself. He had spent a lifetime making sure that he, personally, never paid that price. To truly understand the internal earthquake that was about to strike General Thorne, one must understand the man who stood before him. Thorne, a general by profession, was a soldier by necessity, but at his core, he was a man defined by the absolute, ruthless control of his own will. His father had been a rigid New England industrialist, teaching him from an early age that emotion was inefficiency and that sentiment was a tax on progress. Thorne had risen through the ranks not through charm or charisma, but through sheer, mathematical competence and an unnerving detachment. He viewed his GIs not as individuals, but as complex, expensive units in his enormous, multi-million-man calculation. He ensured they had the best gear, the best training, the best medical support, not because he loved them, but because well-maintained units performed better. He saw them as sophisticated hardware, and he was the chief maintenance officer. His expectations of his men were absolute loyalty and complete obedience. His men knew him to be fair, relentless, and utterly without mercy for failure. They did not love him. They feared his disapproval, which was a far more reliable engine of combat effectiveness. His internal monologue was a constant ledger, a silent calculation of losses and gains. When a young private died, Thorne didn't mourn the life. He calculated the replacement time, the training hours lost, and the unit's temporary drop in combat efficiency. This was the ritual he used to survive the constant slaughter, reducing humanity to metrics. This was his armor, forged in the relentless industrial crucible of war. He was convinced that the man who stops to feel the tragedy of war is the man who loses. Now, consider the man on the other side of that muddy envelope, the deceased German soldier. In the narrative that sustained Thorne and his armies, this man, Feldwebel Klaus Richter, was a faceless fanatic. But Richter was a 40-year-old reservist, pulled back into the fray from his job as a foreman in a small Bavarian mill. He was a veteran of the early Blitzkrieg, but his enthusiasm had withered on the frozen, brutal landscape of the Eastern Front, replaced by a dull dread. Richter's expectation, and the propaganda drilled into him, was that American soldiers were soft, overfed, decadent materialists, all chrome and no spine. He was taught that they would fight only until the going got rough, and then their capitalist individualism would cause them to break. He expected to fight men as purely ideological as his own early self, not the cold, mathematical efficiency of Thorne's relentless advance. By late 1944, Richter knew the war was lost, not because of political missteps, but because the stream of Allied steel never stopped. His entire worldview, once steeped in the glory of the Reich, had narrowed to the simple, desperate desire to see his wife and daughter again. His only remaining ideology was self-preservation and the fear of the Soviets. Thorne, the general, had built an ideological wall, American purity versus German evil. Richter, the soldier, was simply trying to live. The sheer, terrifying gulf between the general's large-scale, mathematical perspective and the soldier's tiny, personal truth was the trap that had been set for Thorne. The general saw the German uniform and ordered fire. He did not see the father, the husband, the foreman, the man who knew, with agonizing certainty, that his life was about to become a piece of forgotten debris in a larger, unstoppable machine. The propaganda had worked perfectly on both sides, creating two necessary fictions: the American general who was a machine of war, and the German soldier who was a soulless automaton. The letter, lying on the desk between the two worlds, was about to expose the lie of both fictions in one devastating instant. The command post was quiet now. The intermittent sounds of distant German retreating artillery had fallen silent, replaced only by the muffled, rhythmic tick of the field clock and the scratch of a pen from a duty officer in the corner. Thorne's mood, though outwardly composed, was darkening. The cost of the recent victory was weighing on him, not in a humanitarian sense, but in the grim, internal bookkeeping of lost time and momentum. He finally pushed the stack of casualty reports away, his attention drawn back to the small, muddy package. The lieutenant's whispered words, "Sir, this one was different," echoed in the general's mind like a sudden, unexpected flaw in his own logic. He glanced at the duty officer, a young man named Lieutenant Stevens, who was pointedly focused on his ledger, avoiding eye contact. Stevens was one of the secondary witnesses, a silent observer to the general's strange hesitation. Thorne picked up his heavy bone-handled letter opener and cut the thread, the small, brittle sound echoing loudly in the quiet room. He unfolded the parchment. It was a single, thin sheet of paper, clearly torn from a small notebook, and the handwriting was tight, disciplined, yet rushed, a man writing under extreme duress. The general, trained to dissect complex battle reports, began to analyze the contents, searching for the key, the intelligence, the code, the message that justified its delivery. He expected a map, a hidden order, a rant about the Führer, or a final, defiant curse against the Allies. His fingers, large and stiff from years of gripping joysticks and penning terse orders, unfolded the paper with a surgeon's delicacy. The ink was faded, slightly smeared by the snow and mud, but the words were clearly German. Thorne's German was good, a necessary tool for intelligence analysis. He began to translate the words in his mind, his inner voice still clipped and efficient, the voice of the general. The letter was addressed simply, "My beloved Hilda." Thorne blinked. Not an officer's report, not a secret communique, a personal letter. He read on, the language simple, direct, devoid of political or military jargon. It spoke of small, heartbreaking things, the cold of the dugout, the persistent, nagging hunger, the sound of the Allied artillery, which he described, with a chilling lack of drama, as the constant, hungry barking of a distant, tireless hound. The soldier, Richter, wrote about his concern that the American advance would cut off his letters, and that Hilda and their daughter, Liesel, might think he had forgotten them, or that he had stopped loving them. He wrote about the simple beauty of a sunrise he had seen through the trench wire, and how it reminded him of the light reflecting off the kitchen table back home. He mentioned Liesel's upcoming birthday, and how he had saved a tiny, smooth, black pebble from a riverbed to send to her. A reminder, he wrote, that beauty is small, hard, and endures even the greatest torrent. Thorne's military mind tried to re-engage, searching for the deception. This is propaganda, a planted letter designed to evoke sympathy. But the details were too intimate, too utterly mundane to be anything but true. He could feel the writer's freezing hand cramping on the page. The general read one sentence that stopped his internal mathematical clock entirely. "Do not worry about the Great War, my dear. I have already lost it. All that remains is the small, quiet battle to return to you." Thorne gripped the edge of his desk. This was not the speech of a fanatic. This was the quiet, agonizing surrender of a man's soul, a surrender not to the American military, but to the crushing weight of his own humanity. The enemy was not an idea. The enemy was a husband, acknowledging his failure to protect his family, having already calculated the grim probability of his own death. Thorne continued, reaching the final, devastating paragraph, written clearly as an afterthought, a final, desperate plea for continuity. "Hilda, if you receive this, if I do not return, promise me this one thing. Tell Liesel that her father was not a hero, but that he was a man who loved her very much. And tell her I found the black pebble. She must keep it close. It is proof that a small thing can withstand the end of the world." General Thorne, the man who had faced down panzer divisions, who had sent young men to their deaths with a clear conscience, who operated solely on the mathematical logic of total war, felt the foundations of his inner fortress begin to crack. The sheer, overwhelming power of this small, quiet confession, a father's love overriding national duty, a husband's desperate goodbye, was an emotional ordinance he had never encountered. He saw the black pebble. He saw the kitchen table. He saw Liesel, not as a faceless enemy child, but as a girl who would never again know the touch of her father. The script, the carefully crafted narrative of absolute good versus absolute evil, was suddenly, violently torn apart. The moment had arrived. The general, standing over the desk, his massive frame beginning to tremble almost imperceptibly, raised the letter one last time, reading the final words. The expected reaction was cold analysis. The reality was about to be a catastrophic emotional breach. The silence that followed was a physical force, heavier than any shell shock. It was the moment General Marcus Thorne ceased to be an Ironhide and became simply Marcus Thorne, a man trapped in the terror of belated recognition. He was not just crying. He was having a seizure of the soul. The tears were not simply water. They were the accumulated backlog of every casualty report he had ever signed, every life he had calculated as expendable, and every moment of human truth he had ruthlessly ignored. He stared at the letter, its smudged ink now a portal into a Bavarian kitchen, a life as real and fragile as his own. The general, who had built his career on the foundation of objective, clinical reality, was confronted by a subjective, crushing truth. He could not look away. His eyes scanned the final desperate lines, his mind, once a supercomputer of logistics, now a broken record, repeating the devastating phrases. "Do not worry about the Great War, my dear. I have already lost it. All that remains is the small, quiet battle to return to you." Thorne felt a sharp, agonizing stab of recognition. Richter, the enemy soldier, had reduced the war to its own mathematical finality, but his equation was purely human. Family outweighed Reich. Love surpassed duty. The true, terrifying message of the letter was that Richter had died not for a monster, but for a memory. He died not as a weapon, but as a man who knew his mathematical probability of survival was zero and accepted it only for the hope that his love would endure. Thorne reached out a trembling finger and touched the smudged parchment, feeling the rough texture of the paper against his skin. He imagined the soldier's freezing hand cramping on the page, the desperate need to communicate the truth of his heart before the war consumed him. The constant, hungry barking of a distant, tireless hound, the letter had said of the Allied artillery. Thorne heard that barking now, but it wasn't the sound of war. It was the howl of his own conscience, unleashed after decades of cold storage. He closed his eyes, and the general saw not maps, but a flickering image of a kitchen table bathed in light, a small, domestic scene that was the very foundation of civilization he claimed to be defending. And yet, He had systematically destroyed the kitchens of his enemies. He had bombed the factories, the rail lines, and the industrial centers, knowing that the damage would inevitably bleed into the simple, mundane lives of men like Richter. "We destroyed that," his mind screamed. "I ordered the fire that took that light away. We traded a kitchen table for a few yards of mud." The shock was total. It was the collapse of the general's carefully constructed ideological shield. For years, he had operated on the principle that the German soldier was an extension of the monstrous Führer and his doctrines. This letter proved that, at the very end, stripped of propaganda and uniform, the German soldier was merely a man trying to endure for the love of a woman and a child. This shattering realization was a mathematical impossibility, an irrational variable introduced into a perfect equation of war. And it broke him. His weeping was silent, a physical shaking that racked his huge frame. He clamped a massive, gloved hand over his mouth, not to stifle the sound, but to contain the horror of this private moment. The world, for Marcus Thorne, had just been inverted. The enemy was not another. The enemy was a mirror. He had killed a man whose primary motivation was the exact, sacred goal the general himself fought for: the preservation of home and family. The sheer, overwhelming irony of their common fate, one signing the death warrant, the other writing the final letter, was a burden too heavy for even Ironhide to bear. The cost of victory, he realized, was not counted in material, but in the identical, heartbreaking desperation of men on both sides of the line. This was the moment the general understood that the war wasn't fought between ideologies, it was fought between fathers. The incident was immediately suppressed. Lieutenant Stevens, having witnessed the unthinkable emotional breach of his commanding officer, was sworn to silence, though the image of the general's ruined face would forever haunt the young officer. The letter itself was discreetly returned to the intelligence file, marked only with a mundane classification code. But for General Thorne, the battle was only just beginning. The true war had moved from the Ardennes to the desolate, echoing chambers of his own heart. The following weeks saw a subtle but profound change in his command style. Outwardly, Ironhide remained. He still demanded precision. He still enforced discipline with ruthless efficiency. His orders remained strategically sound, focused on the mathematical objective of total conquest. But internally, the general was at war with himself, engaged in a psychological campaign more grueling than the Bulge. He found himself paralyzed by an agonizing, relentless empathy. Every casualty report now required a Herculean effort of will to sign. He couldn't look at a German prisoner without seeing Klaus Richter's handwriting, the description of the black pebble that endured. His staff noticed that the general, once obsessed with logistical throughput, was now asking highly unusual questions about the human factor. He began demanding secondary field reports, not on troop positions, but on the personal effects recovered from the dead. This became his secret, morbid obsession. He started reading the personal letters and diaries of the fallen enemy, an obsession he concealed even from his closest aides. He saw not intelligence, but patterns, letters describing small gardens, complaints about the cost of shoes, arguments about the name of a new puppy. These were not the letters of monsters, they were the letters of neighbors. This internal conflict slowed him, introducing a momentary, almost suicidal hesitation into his command. Where he once would have ordered immediate, overwhelming artillery fire, he now paused, calculating not just the enemy's casualties, but the number of small, heartbreaking letters that would be recovered from the wreckage. He began to subtly adjust his priorities, favoring encirclement maneuvers over frontal assaults, not just to save American lives, though that was a welcome byproduct, but to minimize the harvest of human grief that followed every engagement. This strategic shift, from the mathematics of destruction to the arithmetic of compassion, was a direct, powerful result of Richter's letter. He was still calculating, but the variable had changed. Before, the variable was cost per kill. Now, the variable was cost per grief. To cope with this psychological burden, Thorne sought out secondary, confirming anecdotes, a way to prove that Richter was not a single fluke of compassion, but a universal constant. Instead, he found confirmation of his terror everywhere he looked in the classified files. He discovered the story of an American patrol that had taken shelter in a recently abandoned German bunker during a sudden, savage blizzard. They found the bunker stocked not only with the requisite military supplies, but with a small, handmade wooden toy, a tiny, detailed carousel carved with painstaking effort. The intelligence report stated it was meant as a gift for a German officer's son. The GI's reaction was recorded in the report. They left the toy untouched, wrapped in a blanket, and drew a single red cross on the bunker door. These battle-hardened GIs, men trained to view Germans as vermin, had seen a small, undeniable monument to a father's love and had instinctively respected it. They had done what their general could not yet do. They had put the human before the military. The files brought further evidence of this hidden human tapestry. Thorne read the final note of a German teenage soldier, a Volkssturm conscript, whose diary contained only complaints about his boots and a drawing of his mother's kitchen table. His greatest fear was not the American tank, but that he would miss Christmas dinner. Thorne, reading this, felt a fresh wave of agony. He had calculated the lives of children, reducing them to an obsolete fraction. Then came the captured diary of a disillusioned Wehrmacht captain. The officer's writing confirmed Thorne's own internal revolt. The captain had written, "The Führer asks us to accept the impossible, to believe that our sacrifice will result in victory. But I have seen the American trucks. I have seen the endless streams of their supplies. Our war is not a war of heroes. It is a war of numbers. And our number is running out." The general read this not as intelligence, but as a confessional. Here was a high-ranking enemy officer who had also betrayed his duty, not by deserting, but by betraying the official narrative. He had recognized the same mathematical inevitability that defined Thorne's career, but had found the knowledge to be a source of profound, sickening despair, not strength. This intellectual and emotional struggle continued through the final collapse of the German state. Thorne finished his campaign with the same outward success, but he did so as a fundamentally altered man. He was Ironhide fighting with a shattered heart, forcing his will upon an already broken landscape, knowing that every strategic gain was built upon an identical loss of human intimacy. The man who had once believed in the mathematical purity of war now lived only in the gray, agonizing knowledge of its universal, tragic cost. He never mentioned the letter to anyone, knowing that the military couldn't tolerate such weakness. He kept the memory of the black pebble locked inside, a silent, private prisoner of war within the walls of his own unbreakable mind. The General Marcus Thorne who returned home after the victory was outwardly the same legend. He was hailed as a hero, awarded medals, and placed in the high echelons of the newly forming Cold War establishment. He retired with honors, his official record spotless, a testament to his mathematical genius for logistics and command. The story of the general who cried was never told, buried under layers of classified reports and the heavy weight of Lieutenant Stevens's lifelong, fearful silence. Thorne spent his post-war years on advisory boards, his mind still sharp, still calculating geopolitical risks, but his focus had fundamentally shifted. His later speeches and memoranda often featured an uncharacteristic focus on human factors, stressing the need for diplomacy and understanding of foreign cultures, a quiet, professional atonement for his past ideological blindness. His peers found this philosophical turn bewildering, assuming it was the natural softening of age. They never knew it was the ongoing therapy of a man haunted by the love contained in a 3-day-old letter. His resolution came years later, in the final act of his life, a gesture so quiet it almost vanished into history. Upon his death, his will contained no grand military bequests. Instead, he simply requested that a small, smooth, black river pebble be placed in the foundation of a newly established, privately funded veterans hospital wing he had anonymously financed. This was the ultimate resolution. The general could not save Klaus Richter, but he could honor the truth that Richter represented. The black pebble, the symbol of a father's enduring love, was placed in the bedrock of a facility dedicated to healing the psychological and physical wounds of soldiers. The man who calculated death in divisions had ensured his final legacy was built upon a single, small monument to love. The historical record tells the story of General Ironhide Thorne, the logistical genius who helped crush the Wehrmacht through superior force, a great and terrible mathematical certainty. But the personal, emotional truth is that Thorne's greatest victory was over himself, a moment of profound, painful defeat spurred by the enemy he helped to kill. That simple, personal letter rewrote a small piece of established history, demonstrating that even the most fanatical war machine is ultimately composed of fragile, desperate men. The comparison is stark. The historical Thorne is a statue of bronze, cold and imposing. The emotional Thorne is a pool of silent tears, forever reflecting the image of a child who received a pebble instead of her father. The two exist simultaneously, creating a contradiction of legacy, a final testament to the devastating duality of war. And so we are left with the silence of the command post, the quiet grief of a general, and the enduring truth of a tiny, black pebble. War, we are often told, is the clash of great ideologies, of economic titans, of technological superiority. General Thorne believed in this mathematical narrative, calculating every move, every loss, every final objective with the precision of a calculator. But Feldwebel Klaus Richter taught him, at the ultimate price, that the true engine of war is not hatred, but love, the love of home, the love of a wife, the love of a child. It is this pure, untainted human connection that gives men the courage to fight, and it is the loss of that connection that makes the final sacrifice so absolute, so unbearably tragic. We must always remember that every statistic is a man who wrote a final letter, a man who worried about his daughter's birthday, a man who searched a riverbed for a small, hard piece of beauty that might endure the end of his world. The ultimate, sobering question left in the wake of this secret revelation is this: how many thousands of letters did the victorious generals ignore? How many mathematical certainties were purchased at the cost of profound, universal humanity? And if the general who killed him had broken down so completely, what does that say about the true, hidden emotional battlefield of the Second World War? The pebble is placed. The tear has dried. The legend remains. But the silence of that farmhouse, the unspoken grief of a general, reminds us that the only true, uncontested victory in any war belongs to the enduring, heartbreaking power of human love and the terrifying knowledge that, in the trenches, we were all just fathers fighting to get home. The Great War ended in 1945, but the small, quiet battle for General Thorne's soul never truly did. That battle, fought over a single sheet of paper, is the untold truth of the war's most relentless general.